All right. Well, why don't we get started? Good afternoon. Well, I guess it's still good morning, even if you're on the East Coast. Good morning, and on East and West Coasts. I'm John Hallway. I'm an associate dean here at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School, and I'm the executive director of the Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice. On behalf of my colleagues at the Quattrone Center, as well as at the Penn Law's Toll Public Interest Center and Penn Law's Office of Equity and Inclusion, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this conversation on revisiting reform, taking stock 1 year later, which is the latest in our series of conversations on achieving racial justice. It was slightly more than 1 year ago that George Floyd died under the knee of Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, setting off a national and even international outcry and generating a renewed commitment to improving our criminal justice system, in particular a reevaluation of what policing in America is, has been, and should be. And as we continue our series of conversations on achieving racial justice in America, we thought it would be an opportune time to evaluate the progress that we've made on those efforts in the past year. As we know from other complex systems, quality improvement is a never-ending struggle to improve, and it requires constant assessments of what has changed and what still remains to be changed. To help us in that conversation, we've gathered three fabulous, dedicated experts in policing, accountability, and reform. I'm going to introduce you all briefly in alphabetical order, so we'll start, Angelica, with you. Angelica Hendricks is a policy analyst at the Philadelphia Police Advisory Commission, which is a division of the city that provides civilian oversight of police activity. She's been instrumental in Philadelphia's efforts to improve police accountability over the past year, culminating in an influential report that evaluates the Philadelphia Police Department's internal accountability and complaint investigation process, as well as legislative efforts that have recently resulted in the creation of a new Citizens Police Oversight Commission, two important steps forward that we're excited to talk about more in this conversation. Damon Hewitt, who in my screen is in the bottom right-hand corner, your mileage may vary, is the president and executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, where he leads the organization's strategic, programmatic, and operational efforts to advance the fight for racial justice. He served as the executive director of the Executives Alliance for Boys and Men of Color, a philanthropic network of more than 36 national and local foundation presidents that shifts policies, structures, and the false negatives that negatively impact our nation's sons and brothers, and has generated more than $200 million in collaborative grant-making efforts. He's also been a senior advisor for the Open Society Foundation and worked for more than a decade as an attorney at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Of course, all of this was made possible by his time as a student at Penn Law, and we are exceedingly proud to count him among our alumni. David, I hope you don't mind us riding on your coattails for the entirety of your career on that basis.
Hey, great relationship. Let's build it.
And last but certainly not least, Lisa Judge is the Inspector General in the Office of Inspector General in the city of Seattle, which is a relatively new organization there. And she's built a department dedicated to critically examining SPD's use of force and improving its policies, practices, and culture. Her works in progress geared towards institutional change include community-involved sentinel event reviews of significant use of force events, recommending an officer peer intervention program, developing an innovative training program with oversight partners and the Seattle Police Department for effective suspect and witness interviewing. She spent over 20 years as a Tucson city attorney and an in-house counsel for the Tucson Police Department, and was an ACL-approved trainer for court-ordered training on Fourth Amendment law and anti-bias for the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. Now, before we turn to the interesting parts of the conversation, I do have a few administrative items. We are recording this conversation. The Q&A window here on Zoom is enabled and we are monitoring. So if anybody in the audience has a question at any time, please put it in the Q&A. We will see it. We will do our best to answer it in the time we have today. Obviously, keep it clean and respectful. We are recording these proceedings. We're going to post the video on Penn Law and the Quattrone Center websites, as well as on YouTube. So to kick it off, let me ask the panelists this. Damon, you've worked in Washington, D.C. for many years on topics of police reform at the federal level. At the same time, we know policing is local, and I think actually in one of our earlier conversations, you used the phrase hyper-local, with 17,000 police departments across the US, which is kind of a staggering statistic in its own right. Lisa and Angelica, you work with city governments, but governments that engage in different ways with the federal government. Seattle is still under a consent decree from the US Department of Justice. Angelica, you're in Philadelphia, where under former Commissioner Charles Ramsey, DOJ came in to review police practices. But I'm going to start with Damon just because somebody has to go first, and then I'd be thrilled to hear from each of you. What has been successful over the past year at the federal level? What can we accomplish there? And then what are the areas at the city level where we think we're better served by approaching those issues at the city or local level? So like, what are the successes at the federal level, but also are there topics or issues that really aren't suitable for the federal level, given the local nature of policing that Lisa and Angelica, you guys are pursuing where you are? So Damon, why don't we start with you and we'll go from there.
Well, thanks, John, and glad to be with you, Angelica and Lisa, for this important conversation, and thanks to the Quattrone Center for curating it. First I would say at the multiple levels, local, state, federal, there's no one level that will be the saving grace where everything gets done. It's really about the regime that gets created and how various efforts can work in concert, and what I call an intentional complementarity, not just a happenstance complementarity or hodgepodge, which is a lot of what we see now, not entirely, but a lot of what we see now. So how can we have an intentional complementarity? In terms of progress over the last year at the federal level, I can't point to much, just to be honest. But if we rewind a few years, I think what we saw during the Obama era, during the 21st Century Policing Task Force, the fact that there were activists working alongside law enforcement on that task force, really started to give us some hope. And a lot of what the feds do is really two things. It is, well, three things. It's dollars, it's money, it's technical assistance, but also it's signaling and messaging, which is so important for the culture shifts and culture changes that are necessary that hopefully will trickle down or impact the local level. The money is never going to be the majority of a local police department's budget. If it is, then something's very wrong there, but the money does matter. And we've seen the money fund some bad things or even bad actors or misguided actors. The technical assistance does make a difference. It was in our lifetimes, most of our lifetimes, that policing wasn't even viewed as a professionalized force, that it was really the wild, wild west. Sometimes it still feels that way, but it's really been just in the last generation or two where you've seen policing start to come into its own as an industry, for better or worse, regardless of what you thought about it before. So the technical assistance and further professionalization and standards, or at least drive towards standards, does make a difference at the federal level. But if nothing happens at the local level, which I know Angelica and Lisa will talk about, a lot of what happens at the federal level simply doesn't matter. Last thing I'll say, John, at the federal level, it's important, if you look at civil rights legislation just in the civil context, historically, it's been the federal government that has stepped in with statutory frameworks, regulatory frameworks, and enforcement, including prosecution of civil suits, that's made the difference. We need that desperately when it comes to policing accountability. We haven't had enough of it. Sure, we've had lots of high-profile incidents and high-profile prosecutions, but for every prosecution, there's also probably many more declinations of prosecutions because of the limits of current federal criminal law when it comes to accountability. So we need that federal regime as an overlay, just as we do in fair housing, just as we desperately do in voting rights, and in many other areas as well.
Thanks, Damon. Angelica, why don't I turn to you and then to Lisa for the local side, the city side.
Thanks, John, and thanks so much for inviting me, and thanks, Damon and Lisa. I'm really excited for this conversation. For reform on the local level, I think we first have to, as it relates to local level, we first have to start with the question of making sure we're talking about the same thing. And we like to turn to the communities and the residents of Philadelphia here and have them tell us, what does reform look like? And what does reform actually mean? So we spend a lot of our time actually speaking to complainants, speaking to residents. And I know I spend a big bulk of my time on social media, not to play around, but also, just to see how the residents are responding to policing issues. A lot of times we cannot rely on complainants to actually come and make a complaint as it relates to accountability, policing, because that takes mental labor, that's exhausting, that takes, physical labor and just labor in general, and a lot of times that's uncompensated labor. And they are frustrated and overwhelmed by the lack of responses to their concerns as it relates to policing. And so a lot of times we notice the patterns and practices that may lead to misconduct just from social media and speaking to residents as well. And so we have the community tell us what reform is and what they want it to look like. So just recently, Philadelphia has seen a pretty much a stream of wrongful convictions that directly relate to Philadelphia police officers and misconduct. And so, and unfortunately, a lot of those responsible are still on the force. And so what we have done from that is really look into accountability as it relates to discipline and really see how does this pattern keep happening and what can we do about it. And that's just one example. But for reform on the local level is it's definitely more about neighborhoods, communities, and having the residents tell us what they need as it relates to policing. Oh, John, I think you're muted.
Yeah, when the moderator doesn't know how to use mute 16 months into this, it's a real problem. Elisa, I know you've been really focused on that community department conversation and kind of the social contract that exists between communities and policing. Do you want to talk about how you're working to bring that to the forefront in Seattle?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, John. And thanks, Damon and Angelica. I'm also really happy to be here in this conversation with you. Yeah, I think Angelica is right on that at the local level, how policing happens in a community really has to come from community. And frankly, I don't think it does in most communities. And so that's really, I think the biggest area of opportunity for police accountability is to create structures and ways that we can bring community much more into the forefront in terms of decision making. So just in looking at the Seattle Police Department's response to the protests last summer here in Seattle, my office and I felt it was really important to have community at the table in the review process. I think most police departments, when they review their uses of force or they review any actions that they've taken, tend to do it internally and ask and answer the questions that are of interest to them and to policing as an industry. But I don't think they consider the broader concerns and questions that community has. So we very intentionally built a review process that had community members assisting both in the planning of it, the development of it, the staffing of a review panel that had community members, and in the review process itself with community at the table, breaking down specific force incidents and other things that happened last summer that had really negative impacts on community, to figure out what exactly community was concerned about and how working together, having some pretty difficult but very very intentional conversations, can figure out what systemically contributed to those things and how we can move forward together to fix those things to keep them from happening in the future. And I don't know if you want me to talk about any other more global concepts of what I think needs to happen federally or at the local level, John, but that's just one example of what we're doing in Seattle.
I want to hear everything you have to say, so I would say take it away, and we'll let Damon and Angelica respond.
I think Damon raises a really good notion that the federal government can assist by establishing frameworks by which we all kind of work that will standardize some areas of policing. I mean, we all, as a floor, operate under the United States Constitution, and so I think it would be really helpful to have some laws and regulations that strengthen the floor. And I know, Angelica, you're going to take me to task on this, but not ceiling. I would love to see agencies, states, any other jurisdiction go the extra mile to afford as protections to folks, but just as a basic matter of having standardized levels of expectations on the part of people about what policing can bring. Some things come immediately to mind to me, having some basic rules around pursuits, and I know that we do have them in terms of case law and whatnot, but some of the range of that varies wildly. Just in looking at the news in the last few days, and the woman who was subjected to a pit maneuver by an officer who was attempting to pull her over for a speeding violation, and didn't think she pulled over fast enough. Regulations of those kinds of things, so that as a resident of the United States, you can expect a basic level of policing. So I think the federal government, in a legislative way, could assist with establishing some of those kind of baseline standards. At the local level, I think you've got a lot more latitude in what you regulate and how you protect your communities. And also the community level, back to Angelica's point, really important for government and police departments to start taking community concerns into account in how they're policing and what they're policing, and coming up with models that look more like power sharing with community and not just a command and control, we're going to maintain order style of policing. And now I will be quiet for a while.
So
I really agree, Lisa, with what you're saying about the standards. It's just that even now we have these standards like the US Constitution. And if an officer does violate someone's constitutional rights, someone can complain and they'll go through the proper channels to investigate that. But what we recently found in our latest report on police discipline is that a lot of the constitutional rights and even the state constitutional rights are not codified within the standing operating procedures of police departments. And so there are several instances where, as a former public defender, I know what all of the rights are. I know that someone an officer needs a warrant to do this, they need probable cause to do that. But in some aspects, the interpretation of those laws by the state and federal level, those interpretations that comes down in cases or other laws are not also codified in their standing operating procedures. And so we have something where someone could seek a remedy in civil court for their damages from the violation of their constitutional rights. But then when they're asking for disciplinary action in the administrative form, that doesn't happen because those constitutional laws, the officer can claim that they were unaware of them. And so I actually agree, we do need to have more of those laws codified in standard operating procedures.
Well, John, it sounds like Angelica, what she was just referring to is really, indicative of the qualified immunity doctrine about clearly established rights being violated in order to pierce that qualified immunity that officers currently enjoy. This judge-made doctrine, many of us would like to see it abrogated, at least if not outright eliminated. And there's a lot of horse trading happening right now on Capitol Hill among some senators whom we know, including one from the neighboring state of New Jersey, neighboring Pennsylvania, Cory Booker. But there's one specific piece in the bill which is in draft form, but has been, I guess, leaked. So if you look on Politico, you can find the 125-page bill, which my team has been analyzing vigorously in the last few days. One is about no-knock warrants and so-called quick knock warrants, although I'm not sure if the term quick knock applies, but it's very specific. But the reason why it's so specific, I think, is because of exactly what Angelica said. When rights are conceptual or vague, and there's a question as to whether they're clearly established, which frankly is a trap to nowhere, because if the right isn't clearly established, then the officer enjoys qualified immunity. And you wonder at what point is the right ever clearly established if there's no finding of liability or that it's unconstitutional, right? And unless there's a policy that you can articulate against a municipality or a county, then there's really no recompense, no way for a civil litigant to receive recovery. So the bill that's in play now, which we may talk about later, goes into lots of specifics, and one of them is on no-knock warrants. So you would imagine that whether or not that type of limitation on no-knock warrants or quick knock warrants is codified in local police SOPs or standard operating procedures, you at least have a pathway to a finding of liability. You would hope that that's the kind of thing that actually would spur a change to the operating procedures, a change to the training, and also the need for retraining of every officer who's already deployed.
Yeah, and I think, the qualified immunity one is an interesting one, Damon, as you say, because it is judge-made, right? And I think there's this idea, certainly with absolute immunity for prosecutors and other people, that it's grounded in some common law right, but neither of those immunities actually is. It's been created by judges really kind of out of whole cloth. And I think the challenge with qualified immunity, it strikes me, is these sort of, because of the way judges have then written the doctrine, qualified immunity effectively becomes absolute immunity, and it leads to legislation that has to be that precise to deal with all of these instances. If we were to simply redefine qualified immunity and say, even for example, and not everybody is going to agree with me on this, but okay, fine, we get it. Police should have some elevated level of immunity from the average human being because we're asking them to put themselves in situations that are more likely to generate injury, for example. But but something that's intentionally malicious or grossly negligent, there should be an avenue for us to have some way to identify that and compensate people who have been injured and deal with that so that it doesn't happen again. Is there a like Obama sort of tried to do this with the 21st Century Task Force? Could the federal government create a standards organization that might be in this middle ground between the Constitution and case law, and every jurisdiction coming up with their own policies and practices? And before any of the three of you answer, because we're giving continued legal education, I have the awkward job of coming in to say that your first CLE word that you'll need to get credit for this session is criminal, CRIMINAL. Now we can go back to the substance with that word from our sponsors. And let me ask that question. Could the federal government create a standards organization that would serve in that role in ways that private organizations might not be able to? Because healthcare has the Joint Commission, right? The National Transportation and the FAA do that for transportation. We don't really have that in criminal justice.
I think something like that does sound great. However, when we get to the local level, like how much of policing is, there needs to be a quick response to something. And at times the federal government just moves at a very slow pace. I think we all can agree on that. And so if there is a complaint where someone states that an officer did X, and we all believe that this is inhumane, but somehow the officer escapes accountability because that directive is not codified within their standard operating procedure, there needs to be a quick decision to put that in there and to preclude this conduct from happening again. And if it does happen, this officer would be disciplined accordingly. But if we rely on the federal government for that, it could take years to have that standard now placed into a guidance.
Yeah, Angelica, that's always the tension, right, with a bureaucracy like the federal government that moves at a glacial pace sometimes. And I think that agencies and states have to pick up the slack there. But John, you're right to point out, we've got private groups doing that right now, like the International Association of Chiefs of Police offers, model policies and technical assistance for agencies, as does the Police Executive Research Forum. But those are all voluntary, and you can pick and choose kind of what standards you like that they put forth, and frankly, they're put together. I've been on the IACP's policy board for about 10 years or so they're put together by people like me. It's not a group that's been chosen for particular. Well, I guess we have been chosen for particular expertise, but I think the federal government could have some control over what those standards look like, and have it be a mandatory situation for agencies, not voluntary. But you're right, Angelica. Cities and counties and states have to pick up the slack and do things. And I think we haven't yet mentioned the power of state legislation in filling the gap right now. In Washington, there were many police reform bills floated and proffered this last legislative session. And the state of Washington did come out with some of them that will have some significant impacts here. Specifically, things like banning chokeholds, which I think we agree are important issues, and things like making it easier to decertify officers who've been found to have committed certain types of misconduct. And I think those are also ways that the federal government could complement states by having some standards like that. The other thing I will say that I think the federal government should do to help out is make reporting of certain things mandatory, expand the reporting of use of force nationwide, and also stop data.
Yeah, I would just add, the bill I referred to earlier is a version of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. I'm not sure if it will retain the same name if the current version is adopted, but there's some interesting provisions therein about standards, but it seems to fall short of requirement. It seems to be more about standards that are designed to promote a culture shift, again, a deeper professionalization, a deeper, more enlightened understanding. But with 17 approaching 18,000 law enforcement agencies, it's difficult. And I think that one of the big pieces that, I think our, Lisa and Angelica understand, but I want to make sure that the audience understands as well, is that most police departments in this country are really small. They're fewer than 50 officers. And so to do things at scale, or do things even just the right way, whatever we think the right way is, can certainly be challenging. I mean, I myself wonder, why do we need so many small police departments? I live in Silver Spring, Maryland. It's not an incorporated area, so there's not a Silver Spring police department, but you go a mile away, there's a Tacoma Park Police Department, but there's still Montgomery County Police. And there's also, state troopers, not far away. So all these various levels, I wonder, why do we need all of them? Are we over policing ourselves? And we'll talk about this down the agenda, I'm sure, but we have so many law enforcement officers, many of whom are probably underpaid for the work that they do, but we're also asking them to do far too many things. And so we just multiply, magnify the problem of the training, of the uptake, of the consistency when you have so many different agencies. So I'd love to see a future when we actually have fewer agencies. I'm not saying eliminate the police. I think some people would talk about abolition. All I'm saying is that, why do we need so many different agencies of the type that we have now? It just makes the puzzle that much more complex.
Yeah, I think you raise a really good point there, Damon. I mean, I think Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, which is one of the suburb counties here in Philadelphia, has 55 police departments. And West Philadelphia, where Penn sits, has 5, including the university's police. So there's 5 different departments that regularly patrol the University City area with different objectives, and some are armed and some aren't, and et cetera. But the overlap can make, I think, the imposition of standards, much more challenging. But you raise an interesting question also, in that, are we asking these officers to do too much? So is there some sort of balancing of a removal of certain responsibilities or a partnership of responsibilities that would allow us to standardize, there's that word again, sort of the size of departments? If you go look at the UK, right, where they have national police departments, they won't have an office that has fewer than 100 officers. And so they've sort of looked at where they think is the right size for a precinct or a department, which then allows them to deliver service over a particular geographic area in a more quality, in a way that's more unified in terms of quality. So I think those are important questions, and interesting to see kind of how that plays out.
I'll just throw out there, there's 2 features that are somewhat unique to the American landscape that actually contribute to policing being what it is. One is just the expanse of geographic area, especially in your kind of semi-rural or outer ring suburbs or counties. Like, there's a lot of geographic area to cover. And then conversely, you have extreme density. If you think about Center City, Philadelphia, or even West Philadelphia, where I used to live when I was in law school at Penn. But you also have a gun culture, where we have more guns in this country than people, and far more guns than police. And so, I think that those factors out, we could talk about that for the next 2 hours, but those 2 things, the geographic density versus breadth, and also the gun culture, I think they skew what we think we need from policing and what some of the answers are and should be.
So I'd like to go back, Angelica, to something that you talked about, and Lisa, which is the intersection between the social contract and hearing what the community says they want out of policing and using that to guide reform efforts. One of the things that we've seen is, for example, and I've seen this in a couple of different states, certainly in Pennsylvania and other places, where the community ask of police is different in Philadelphia than it is, for example, in Scranton or in Harrisburg, or, you know, the central part of the state, which is more rural, has differences in what they're looking for out of policing than the urban centers. And therefore the state police kind of reflect a different culture often than the city police. And so I'm curious, as you do your reviews of social media and other things, you know, I'm noticing a book on the back of your bookshelf from somebody who might have said, hey, even within the Black community, we don't always have a unified voice about what we want from our police. So I'm curious about, as you approach reforming within Philadelphia, how do we balance all of the voices of increasingly diverse communities to give police a message that enables them to succeed?
Thanks, John. And to the audience, the book that John is discussing is Locking Up Our Own by James Forman Jr. Highlighted that on my bookshelf because he's a former public defender, and I'm also a former public defender. And once you're a former PD, you're always a PD. But he wrote a book about, you know, the struggle between emerging, you know, violence in the communities and the need for police, and having us try to, the different factions of folks trying to resist enhanced policing in the communities and trying to shift to see what other forms of safety that we can imagine for ourselves. And so here in Philadelphia, there's definitely big groups trying to decide what is policing going to look like here in Philadelphia. So we have, I'm sure all of you know that Philadelphia right now is about, we're over 30% more homicides than we were last year. We're bumping up against the largest number of homicides that Philadelphia has seen since the 60s. And so there are these different factions that are asking for, you know, more police to get involved to help solve homicides and deter homicides. But then there are others who, you know, rightfully so, are thinking, well, maybe we need to imagine something else. And so what we're trying to do is really just listen to all aspects of the community to just see and just amplify community voices in this. And so this comes up in the, we actually did a review on gang databases in Philadelphia and how does that look like, and the due process that individuals who could be a focus for gun violence that they need. We can't just target individuals and say, hey, you may enhance violence in your community, and so we need to do X, Y, Z. Like, no, individuals need more due process. They need to feel protected from others and even from police themselves. And so what we try to do is try to find a way for the community to have a seat at every single discussion. And so even as it relates to discipline, we are asking in our most recent report, we're asking for the community to be involved in the disciplinary panels when at the current structure for police discipline, the hearings are held in front of all sworn law enforcement. And so we're asking for civilians to be a part of that. We're asking for civilians to act as the prosecutor aspect in that. And so what we want to do is have more residents involved in this conversation so they can share their perspectives and share, you know, the role that they imagine policing in their communities.
So Lisa, Seattle's a pretty progressive city. Yeah, tell me how you're approaching this in a place where maybe not everybody is like the center of Pennsylvania.
Right. Yeah, sure. And it's hard to go after Angelica because she always talks about things that make me want to go off and talk about what she's talking about. But in my experience, you know, what communities want of their police really widely varies. Rural versus city, you're looking at different kinds of crimes or things that people are concerned about and want assistance with from police. When you're talking about cities of varying sizes, in my experience, having worked now in two what are considered major cities in the policing world, it really demographics has a lot to do with it. Where I came from in Tucson, Arizona, there were very few people of color other than Latinos. And so, when you have a city that is largely populated by people for whom the system has generally worked and generally works, what looks like engagement with community there is things like coffee with a cop and getting to know your officers and things like that. When you move to an environment like Seattle, where there are many more communities here who have been historically disadvantaged and left out of conversations, communities for whom policing hasn't worked and has been by design kind of kept out of away from the table and out of conversations. The conversations there about policing look more like how do you, we want to say in how you police us and what you're policing in our communities and how we can also police our own communities and not have as much governmental involvement in how we keep our communities safe. And so they're really different conversations that government has to have with the communities based on, I think generally the community's experience historically with systems. So coming here, it's been really important to get out there and try to cultivate relationships in communities where people haven't felt like they've had a voice or a say in government, and try to figure out how those experiences can be brought into the conversation with government, how problem solving can happen between government and those folks, and how trust can be built. Because in my experience, the lack of having a voice or having representation comes also with a complete absence of trust in government, in the system. And I have no idea if that was responsive to your question or not, but
if I could just follow up, John, just on that, there are other institutions that require assistance from police that we also need to challenge those institutions. And for example, I believe under Commissioner Ramsey here in Philadelphia, back in the day, the Philadelphia Police Department used to respond to every traffic accident that happened. And then Commissioner Ramsey was like, why are we involved in traffic accidents if they don't involve, bodily injury, if people can walk away and move the vehicles? But then you have these insurance companies that require, the drivers to file a police report. If someone steals from my home and I just want my insurance to cover the lost damages, but the insurance company requires me to then file a police report. These are institutions that are requiring citizens to interact with policing in ways that policing, they didn't ask for this. They did not. And we have financial institutions demanding the public to engage with police.
Well, that's so well said. I think you put it so well, Angelica. We're misusing the resource, and it's a way that everything becomes policing, and policing becomes everything. It threatens to turn us into a police state, quite frankly. So we have to unlearn that reliance across the board. I think even just living in a community, you face it. Hey, there's young people out there, or potentially young people out there with loud music and noise. Do you call the police? And for me, the answer is going to really end up being no, because who knows what's going to happen when the police come out. But you also have to make a judgment. Do you walk out there yourself at 2 o'clock in the morning in a way that could be viewed as confrontational? So we're kind of stuck with this. What's my alternative? What's the response? How do you handle that situation? And everybody makes their own decisions in their own community, but the lack of options, the lack of creativity, and just the over-reliance, the knee-jerk reliance that is structural, as you mentioned, Angelica, is deeply problematic. It's in our corporate structures. It's in landlord-tenant law. If there's an eviction, you're going to have a constable or a sheriff, handling that, because they have the monopoly on the authorized use of force, and we rely on it way too much.
So, I'm curious. Angelica mentioned that we have simultaneously a desire to reform the police and an upswing, particularly in urban jurisdictions around the country, in violence. A lot of factors come into that. COVID-19 certainly has a factor. But when we talk about reducing the things we're asking the police to do, there is sort of a quality of life regulation that we'd like to have in our communities. I think about in Philadelphia, we're having a big issue right now with ATVs and dirt bikes that are being driven around the city. And they're, technically speaking, not street legal. Either way, they're very noisy and they can be very dangerous. We don't want police chasing those people because that increases the danger. But there are a lot of residents who legitimately get concerned about the noise and the risk and things like that. So I guess I'm curious about, your thoughts on whether we should be creating other government organizations or bifurcating within the infrastructure of police things that are armed or unarmed, or going some other route?
I think one thing that could be helpful is sort of like a mediation aspect. And for the ATVs, I cannot comment on ATVs because I'm not from Philadelphia. That's a Philadelphia culture. I cannot comment on a culture of another group that I have nothing to do with. I'm from Virginia. I'm going to stay my mindset in Virginia. I don't understand the culture, but it's also not mine. And I know people enjoy it, and it's been around for decades.
But let me push on that for just a second, because you live in Philadelphia.
I have, but I'm not from Philadelphia. Some people were born and raised, and they looked at dirt bikes. They were immersed in the culture, and that is a culture. I'm not going to go to another country and comment and say something about their culture. I think ATVs is a culture of Philadelphia, and I'm going to respect other people's culture. That's just what it is. But I think mediation could be impactful as it relates to like the ATV conversation. Some people may say it as a form of mental health, or even with policing. And for example, our agency, we just started a mediation practice where we're trying to amplify the voices of community and have them be able to express their concerns to the actual police officer who may have harmed them in some way. A lot of the complaints that we receive come from individuals who are calling the police, and when they arrive, they receive, disappointing services, and they may not want this officer to experience discipline, but they may want a better relation from this officer. They frequently see them in their community, at their place of employment or something like that. And so what we're hoping to do is trying to create more opportunities for dialogue instead of minimizing those opportunities.
I would,
John.
Sorry, please go ahead.
Sorry,
Lisa.
Dan, go ahead.
No, you first, please.
I'm the
I just want
moderator.
to say,
Lisa goes.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, John, in answer to your question, I think it's all of the above, right? I think nothing should be off the table in terms of disentangling police from problem solving in communities. Because you can pick up the phone and call 911, I think that, they've obviously become the de facto problem solvers for everything, whether or not it's truly public safety related or safety related. So thinking about those things about, okay, when you have a noise complaint or you have some quality of life issue, is there a way, a non-police way that we can think of to maybe move some funding into that, have unarmed, we have community service officers here in Seattle. I know you've been involved in conversations in our Sentinel event group about having even paid community members, who understand the particular needs of their own communities out doing some of that work, hopefully in an unarmed capacity. But, I think you can think about all kinds of ways that you can have a model that keeps armed officers for serious violent incidents, response to those, and then has a variety of folks like mental health professionals co-responding with officers to people in crisis, other folks who have some training and experience in mediation that go out to resolve neighbor disputes, things like that. I think all of those things should be part of the thinking around where policing needs to adapt. And I've been chastised for using the reform word. Seattle has reform fatigue, so I describe it as evolution or adaptation of policing.
And so those words matter. And speaking of that, our second CLE code is the word justice. So JUSTICE, we're 2/3 of the way done. Damon, you want to jump in here?
Sure. Just on a narrow point, you asked about, should the dollars be, I guess, diverted, or should the money just be repurposed? I do think it's a combination of both. I don't have an empirical analysis handy, but the spending on law enforcement has grown exponentially over the years, just the way spending has grown on prisons and mass incarceration. So we have to take a look at that and can't ignore the overall dollar amounts. Even and the spending is not increasing salaries for law enforcement, exponentially. So what's the money really being spent on? We should ask ourselves that. But also, there's some things that you don't really need a law enforcement agency to do. Efforts at divesting and reinvesting in different types of services and different types of functionalities. There have been experimentation with that in places like California on a grand scale, not so much with policing per se, but the criminal justice system overall. And there's a lot to learn, pro and con, from those types of efforts. But I think that the baseline remains the same. There has to be the right calibration. I don't know why we would entrust all services that communities need to law enforcement, where people are being trained at the State Police Academy. They're just not built for it. So why have them do it? One other thing I will say too, and this is an admonition I've heard from Hans Minos, one of your former colleagues, Angelica, is that if we rely on social service agencies and others, they can also be infected with structural racism or impacted by it, right? So it's not as if there's some panacea. All of the agencies that engage the public must be held accountable in various ways. Now, of course, social service agency employees aren't carrying weapons and billy clubs and tasers, or mistaking guns for tasers and what have you. So it's a different type of potential harm, but there could still certainly be harms that impact communities very deeply.
And a lot of those social justice agencies, when they see officer-involved shootings, use of force, and just oppression as it relates to policing, they use these endeavors to, fundraise for the community. And then the communities don't see a lot of the fruit from that. There are other groups that are fundraising and gathering money off of these systems, but that money somehow is still not going to the community. And so that's why we need more community input with that. But yeah, that's a great point, Damon.
So we have a question in the chat that is something that I had assumed we'd get to at one point or another. So this seems like as good a time as any. And the question is, what role are police unions currently playing in the ongoing conversation about reform? And how might our communities mobilize in concert with, or in navigation around, as the case may be, police unions?
Wow, that's the money question. I would say there's two things happening right now as we speak. The general pattern is obstruction of any type of change. That's certainly a pattern that we've seen. Efforts to block any efforts towards accountability. We've filed amicus briefs and litigation that has involved or been filed by police unions in New York and Hawaii and Washington, D.C., or any events. Body cameras, no, we don't want that. A registry that identifies officers who have been found to engage in misconduct, no, we don't want that. Like everything. Now, we actually have a little more complicated picture just in the last few days, where there's been a bit of a schism in the national policing community, so police union or police fraternal organization community. So organizations, for example, like Fraternal Order of Police at the national level, and I believe also IACP, International Association of Chiefs of Police, have signaled support for the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act revision, the revisions there too that have been made public, leaked, I guess, just the last several days. But you see National Sheriff's Association and others challenging it. And so, one thing I've hewed to in the work I've done with law enforcement is to work with three different types of groups. It's frontline officers individually, whose interests are often not served by these unions, not very well. Officer of color and women officer fraternal organizations, who have a lot to say through their experience, and frankly, sometimes they're the most paranoid people you ever meet, because they're not trusted sometimes by community, but it's difficult for them to trust fellow officers as officers of color or women officers in terms of some of the things that they face. But another group is law enforcement leaders, who actually have to figure out, regardless of what the rules are at the federal or local level, how do I build a culture? How do I build competency and great skill set, and have these officers engage in what they would consider constitutional policing, right? But at every level, I sometimes wonder, are the unions, police unions, actually serving the interests of the front line, of the Black and Latino and women officers, or also are they in league and in line with aligned with the police leadership? And the answer sometimes, or most times rather, is no. So I hope that the recent developments at the national level signal some type of turning point, some type of acknowledgement that at the very least, when you have egregious conduct, like Officer Chauvin, who kneeled in the neck of George Floyd for over 9 minutes, we now know, that we start to see some commentary from some police unions saying, look, that is beyond the pale. That's not what happens every day, that particular type of incident, that, slow murder, frankly, but it's a starting point to open up a conversation. that is not a conversation about how do we pillory individual officers, but how do we look in the mirror for officers as an industry, as a group, to understand better what are we doing. I think Congresswoman Val Demings said it best in one of her op-eds, and I will paraphrase here. She said, look, I'm a longtime law enforcement leader. She was the police chief in Orlando, but she basically said, what the heck are you doing? What are we doing here? And I think there have to be some openings, and the unions have to lead the way. But look, there's diversity among law enforcement supportive groups too. They don't always agree. I think we have to just exploit those and leverage those moments of traction where we can find them.
I think in Philadelphia, we try to take a systems approach where we try to understand exactly where, is everyone's role within this mega system. And so as it relates to discipline, which is a huge report that we just finished, and we're going to move on to part 2 now. We really wanted to see, like, where is the union's role in this? So we're looking at, the filing of the complaint, investigation has been sustained. Someone's going to have a hearing. Okay, let's say the person is found guilty. The commissioner imposes discipline, and then the union gets, the union's been involved the whole time, but then there's a grievance been filed. And so a very common argument by the union is that this officer has been disciplined and received X amount of suspension days or even terminated without just cause. The commissioner didn't adequately explain their decision to enforce this type of discipline. And from the resident perspective, that's maddening. It's always maddening to have, if you do a harm, there's going to be a consequence. But I understand those due process levels. Like, as a former public defender, if a judge sentences my client without the reasons on the record, I'm filing that appeal, because the reasons need to say on the record. You have to say, I've considered these mitigating factors and I have excluded them. They are no concern because your conduct that you did was so egregious. And so that was actually one of the recommendations we made in our recent report. There are so many officers who are escaping accountability because the commissioner was not explaining their decision. And so that was a recommendation that we made, and that we're trying to assist the Philadelphia Police Department now of creating a disciplinary matrix to try to narrow down how they're coming up with their decisions. So that way, when this case goes to arbitration, like we know most of them do, when the union does have these arguments, the department is better, and the city is better prepared to make their argument. So what we're trying to do is really just trying to give as much fight to those who can make these decisions and have these decisions stay in effect while the union is trying to counteract them.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a lot more to add to what my colleagues have put forth on unions. I think they've done a really excellent job of that. I would highlight that, it's really a challenge for chiefs. I think we all recognize that culture is probably one of the biggest issues in police departments, and getting that shift for departments to move forward. And it can be really challenging for chiefs to set a tone and set a culture or change culture when that culture is divergent from that of the whatever union leadership's philosophies are at the time. So that can be really challenging. I think Damon's right to point out that one way to work with unions is to point out their self-interest and moving in a progressive direction before there's legislation or something that forces them to do something that they may think is even more onerous. So I think getting them to see, like, the train on the tracks or hear the whistle, and getting them to move on their own in that direction can help. Also, state law. There were some efforts in Washington at trying to change arbitration or to remove arbitration as a means for union employees to challenge discipline, police union employees. So I think, some of the things that folks have to do is lobby their state legislatures to create more palatable structures in which police unions can operate.
So one of the other questions we have here in the chat, we've used the word accountability a lot in this conversation, and there are different levels of accountability as we've discussed. There's the individual accountability that the officer has to act in ways that are, to protect and serve and within policy, and in ways that we then find, quote unquote, just. There's the organization's role, the department's role for accountability, right? To make sure that they're taking accountability for the acts of their officers and things like that. But then there's also a larger kind of systems responsibility. And Angelica, you talked about everybody having their role, right? In some sense, the union has a role for ensuring due process is given to officers who deserve that in their line of work. Like, they're putting themselves in these difficult situations, and it's reasonable that there be an appropriate process that evaluates them in the light, that we're putting them in. You mentioned at the beginning of this that we've had like 21 wrongful convictions in Philadelphia. And in fact, I think in about a half hour, the DA is announcing a press conference where they're putting out a report and a review of those. One of the questions that we have in the chat is, how do we or should we force line prosecutors to be responsible for acting upon police misconduct they discover in their cases? And I would note in the exonerations, you have official misconduct, which sometimes involves police officers and sometimes involves prosecutors. So it's not like anybody is, dipped in gold or purity in these scenarios. Everybody's got their challenges, but prosecutors can and should be part of that accountability mechanism, right? So I'm curious about the group's thoughts on that topic.
Well, I'll just say, there's a number of people who consider themselves, I guess, progressive prosecutors. There's kind of a kinship among them nationwide, and right there in Philadelphia, I think DA Larry Krasner is among them, and you can't help but see the PBS, the Frontline, I guess, whatever the show is that's on documenting the early part of his work there in Philadelphia. But there's one innovation in particular he introduced, which is why I mentioned him, that has now been adopted at least in one other jurisdiction that I know of, Prince George's County, where Aisha Braveboy is the state's attorney, which is to indicate and announce that there are officers who have a challenged relationship with the truth, and we're simply not going to rely upon their testimony. And so it's one thing after the fact to have some accountability for a half-truth, a mistruth, or an outright lie, because look, people are human, and that does happen. It happens in any industry, but when it happens in policing, it has drastic consequences. But it's another thing to say, look, we're going to act like we know, in vernacular, right? We're actually going to not pretend that this is a one-off incident. We're not going to allow, we're going to shift culture by saying we're not going to tolerate that anymore. And so if you want to get a quote unquote collar in police vernacular, do it the right way. And if you actually want to see an actual prosecution or a conviction, you actually have to be on the up and up. You have to have clean hands when you come to us. So I applaud DA Krasner and State's Attorney Aisha Braveboy for taking that step. It certainly did not endear them to at least the unions, but I actually suspect that there's some leaders among the ranks of law enforcement and some rank and file who say, finally, thank you, because it makes my job easier.
As a former public defender, I have seen the false promise of we're not going to rely on this officer's testimony, because that doesn't mean that the case is going to go away. What it means is that the officer that has the misconduct, they will not call them themselves to testify. And there is a huge example to this. There was a Philadelphia resident, his name is Hassan Bennett, and he was convicted for a homicide that he did not commit. I actually sat in on his own defense of his fourth retrial, where he represented himself by himself, pro se. And the detective who he alleged was involved in the misconduct that led to his arrest, that then led to his conviction, the district attorney's office did not call that detective to testify. So Mr. Bennett had to call him himself to testify, and he used this argument in his closing. It's like, why did I have to call this detective who they know was responsible for all these other, grievances and exonerations myself? Why didn't the district attorney's office present that information? And he was acquitted within 10 minutes. And so we have to resist the notion that, they're not going to rely on this testimony, because that doesn't mean they're not going to seek a conviction. That's
profound.
So turning to another question in the chat, this question has been asked a couple ways in the Q&A, but we've talked about defunding the police, and we know that is a big reform push, that there are groups of people who say defund the police, and yet one of the things that we also know is, to the extent that there are social services that we're asking the police to do, we might want to do those more or better. To the extent that there are things that we'd like police to do differently, we might want to increase training. To the extent that we want to have critical incident assistance, that might be a new specialized skill, or require people with advanced degrees, or take people who historically work 9 to 5 and now have them work 24 hours a day. So I guess one question about the conversation is, as you all think about the defund movement, right? Is there a better word we should be using for that group? And do we really mean we should pay for the services we want? Are we willing to accept increase in funding if the services are better? Or do we really mean defund is what's necessary and this is a budget thing? Like how do we think about that, and how should we be thinking about that to be constructive in improving the system going forward? Lisa, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think for me, it's really a realignment of the system, and a realignment of resources with the actual need in community. I think there's much to be taken from the defund and abolish movements in terms of thinking about what really needs to be a police issue and what really should be something that's handled by another social service, another community group, something like that. So, for me, I guess those terms have become loaded in our world today, but the driving need behind it, I think, is real and huge. And I've been in this industry for more than half a century, or no, I'm not that old, quarter of a century. Sorry, I'm bad at math. That's why I'm a lawyer. But I think cops have been complaining forever that they're called on to do things that they're not trained for, that really shouldn't be their jobs, to cure the ills of society. And so we have to have conversations about how to parse those things out and take those things away and handle them thoughtfully. Handle the enmeshment with policing where it still needs to occur, but move those things away and let police, armed police, function on responding to violence, and also to engage in relationship building. Because I think one unintended consequence of just having armed police that just do the bad things is there's really going to be no relationship between them and community. So I think you've got to also have that balance where they are guardians in situations where you need an armed officer, but they also have care and respect, and there's caretaking involved in how they handle that job.
Yeah, I think there are about, two, well, there are more than two, but two main groups are considering, we need to shift funds to other social servants, and not just social servants who have, professional licenses, but the servants who are in the communities who may have more experience, but may not have the professional license to do this role, but can still serve their communities. So like just recently, there's a huge movement in Philadelphia to provide more, mental health for, gun violence, because it's a health epidemic. And so that's one landscape. And then the other is we have individuals who are asking for police departments to, have millions of dollars taken from their budget. And we have to just also view that from like a municipal law perspective and try, I'm not an economist, but like try to see how that would work. And so we were discussing this before, where Philadelphia and like other places have civil service commissions. And so that movement to take millions of dollars from a department the result of that may not look like what the communities expect for it to look like. Because according to some civil service laws, once you do that and there are layoffs that are imposed, the layoffs are going to occur in reverse order. So the last ones hired are going to be the first ones to go. And so what the department is going to be left with of some, faces that actually don't look like the community. And then those who may have been laid off are going to get into the drop system or the pension program, where there's the city is actually still going to be paying money for some benefit, either a health benefit or pension system. And so I think there needs to be, you know, if the community is asking for this, and there has to be those who are willing to sit down, look at the numbers and see, well, how can the movement of funds happen and the result actually looks like what the community wants it to look like, because it may not look like what the community wants it to look like. And so that's why we have to be very precise in how, you know, that change occurs.
You know, I'm going to drop into the chat here, John, a link to a document that I, you know, often, you know, periodically take a look at as I'm thinking about various proposals and debate, because I think there is often a dichotomy between defund the police and grow the police's reach and influence. So, you know, the chart, if I could just, I hope everyone can see the link here, or the document at the link, is from a group, I think this is from Critical Resistance. At the top, there is a list of what, in red, of what are considered reformist reforms. There are a lot of measures that a lot of local police departments have used that, you know, Lisa and Angelica, and I'm sure other audience members have certainly seen before. Those are viewed as a negative by this organization, by this group. But I want you to look at the items in green. Just look at the bubbles on the left margin. Suspend the use of paid administrative leave for cops under investigation. Withhold pensions and don't rehire cops involved in excessive force. Require cops to be liable for misconduct settlements. Cap overtime accrual and overtime pay for military type exercises. Withdraw participation in police militarization programs. Prioritize spending on community health, education, affordable housing. The last was probably most controversial: reduce size of the police force. But if you look at this analysis, I won't say it's the gold standard or anything like that, but there are a lot of things in the green bubbles that people who agree with some of the things in the red bubbles, who like those things, what might also agree with. So, you know, I think that if we get trapped in the dichotomous, thank you for putting up there, dichotomous type of conversations, we just kind of, everyone just falls back, retreats to their corners and you know, puts up their dukes and is ready to fight. But I think if we complicate the analysis a little bit, we can actually make things more simpler, a little more simple, ironically, by just looking at what are the areas of agreement where we think we really want to see movement without thinking about entrenched interests, which I think too often is the conversation, especially inside the Beltway here in the DC area.
Yeah, and I think even just looking at body cameras as the first one, you know, does it, not only does body camera, yes, it might increase funding to police, but it increases transparency, it increases accountability, it provides all sorts of opportunities for case-based training that provides real-world scenarios to help other officers learn and improve over time. And in fact, when we've talked at the Quattrone Center, we've gone to departments that don't have body cameras. Most of the officers themselves are like, look, we understand that people have privacy concerns, but we'd much rather have them because we find it resolves disputes. Even in the instances where we're wrong, we get to a resolution that allows us to then take on that organizational obligation to say, we get it, we did this wrong, we can do it better next time. Mm-hmm. And we feel it promotes good policing within our organization. So I think, you know, opportunities like that to help police be the kind of police they want to be for the community become really important too. Lisa?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that all of those things, you know, I think we could come together and say, these are good ideas in many jurisdictions, including Seattle. Most, if not all of those things that I heard you mention, Damon, are bargainable here. And so even body cameras, Seattle officers get extra pay for wearing body cameras because there is an argument that they impact their working conditions. So, you know, one of the big complicating factors in moving in some of these directions that many of us would agree are the way we need to go is restrictions in collective bargaining agreements and other, you know, foundational laws and regulations in certain communities.
So let me see, I will stop share, but Damon, thanks for sharing that document and the unexpected visual. We don't often get those in our panel presentations. So another question that we have here in the Q&A deals with, I guess, again, with the process of making sure you've got all of the diverse community voices in making recommendations of reform, in part to facilitate these sort of more nuanced conversations that we've been talking about. The question is how are we ensuring that limited English proficient communities, especially those of color, who might be most at risk of over-policing are contributing their viewpoints to reform conversations so that we really can, get that representation of all of our communities in what we're talking about.
It's a great question, and I think it's a huge gap. I'm not aware of many communities that are really doing that right and doing that adequately, but I think that's certainly an area that needs a lot of attention and care, and that's right on. I mean, if you want to talk about the most underserved communities, they are probably communities that also have a language barrier. So I don't know that I have a lot to add in terms of what we're doing, but I think I would wholeheartedly, endorse that as an area of challenge and need for all of us that work in police accountability.
I'm not saying that we're definitely perfect. We do have language line access where we're able to communicate with residents in any language. We actually just recently had a public meeting specifically for our ASL community. And so we are also able to receive complaints and speak with those complainants from that community as well. The Philadelphia Police Department just updated their limited English proficiency and ASL directives. And just recently they were at one of our public meetings explaining this directive. And we had the assistance of other individuals who, speak other languages for interpreters as well as ASL there. So we're actually actively trying to enhance our communication there.
The spirit of the question makes me think about a whole different frame than most of our conversations typically are about, because it's really about responsiveness and connectivity to communities. And I think we can see some lessons in terms of, positives and also maybe some gaps in a couple of areas. One is with respect to the dramatic rise in hate crimes against Asian American residents throughout the country. You see it a lot on the coasts, but also, frankly, throughout the country, not even in areas where there's high population of Asian immigrant communities or just Asian American communities generally, immigrant or not. So I think the degrees of responsiveness that we've seen or not seen, there are lessons there, especially to the extent that there are language barriers in those communities. And look, the language barriers can be really profound because most folks in high school or college, you're not learning Mandarin, as a dialect. You're not learning most Asian languages, which there are very many. You may know a bit of Spanish, a bit of French, European languages typically, or Latin languages, but you're not going to typically learn others. So the barriers can be profound. And so having cultural competency, having bridges and deep connections matters a lot. Another area to look also is with respect to hate crimes against Black Americans, which still are the leading victims of hate crimes in this country, sadly. At the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and the Law, we have what we call our James Byrd Jr. Center to Stop Hate, named in honor of the late James Byrd, who was killed by white supremacists in Jasper, Texas in the 1990s. We work closely with his surviving family members on work to lift up his spirit and energy. And we also partner with the Matthew Shepard Foundation, named after the late Matthew Shepard, to conduct trainings for law enforcement agencies around the country on responsiveness to hate crimes in intersectional ways. So you think about what's happening with Black trans women, for example, throughout the country. Does law enforcement actually get it? So I think when you look at the examples of where there's been great response or good response, even after the fact of the horrible incidents, and where there hasn't been, there's a lot to learn about connectivity and new awareness. I can tell you in some of the early trainings that our staff at the Lawyers Committee did, all the reports were that law enforcement and community alike were in tears together. People started to see their humanity in one another and figure out what can we do to protect, to see each other and protect the communities that are being impacted.
And Lisa, I mean, that, in full disclosure, Lisa and I are working together on a Sentinel event review in Seattle with community participants and police officers of different levels of seniority. But what Damon is describing sounds a lot like the process that we've been seeing. Maybe you could talk about your perspective on how we bridge the gap so that the police actually understand what the community is asking for, and the interactions are kind of recognizing the injuries in productive ways.
Yeah, I think historically, government and communities, um, especially impacted communities, talk past each other, or they're just having different conversations. So what we decided to do in facilitating the Sentinel event review process we have in Seattle was to use a peacemaking circle process. And so we have a community member who does work in prisons with prison gangs and groups that have deep historical conflict with each other. He brought that to our discussions with this group, and we spend a significant amount of time at what we call in circle, really listening to each other and getting to know each other as human beings and people, and developing a care for each other and a respect for the experiences of one another. And I think it's really built a level of trust and a relationship among the group where we can push back on each other and talk through some really hard things, in terms of race and the impacts of policing on community. And I have seen a breakthrough in the police officers on this panel, and just being able to really hear and kind of feel, with their hearts even, the experiences of the community members. And it almost feels like sometimes, John, I don't know if you experience this, you can almost see light bulbs go on about, this is a person who's living through this experience, and I'm responsible for that, and I need to come at it from a different perspective of understanding and caring. And you want to chime in?
I have seen that, and to be fair, I've also seen it the other way, right? I've seen it where citizens, an officer will explain why a particular policy is some way, or why they acted the way they did, or their intentions in the moment, and the community member will have a light bulb that's like, oh, this wasn't intended to be a destructive act. It's just an act that went sideways and had the result. So I think those conversations are really useful. I think the open question, I think we get this in our group and others, is can you translate that personal interaction that leads to greater awareness? Can that be done at scale? And when we start talking about reforms in the circles that Damon's walking around in on Capitol Hill, can you do that level of individual awareness and empathy, and does that translate then to a larger level of reform, and how might we do that? I just want to kind of keep us on schedule a little bit and get our last CLE word out there, because I know you've all been waiting for that. The last CLE word is reform. REFORM, reform. And so those of you who have CLE, if you'll submit those and you'll get full credit. In the time that we have left, let me ask each of you, and we'll go in alphabetical order again. So we've had 12 months. We've had, I think, a lot of successes. Obviously, a lot more to do in the federal things. The federal issues Damon sort of said are in process, and we got a 125-page bill to look at. Let me ask each of you what your top 1 or 2 priorities would be for reform in the next 12 months. If we were to have this conversation again next June, what would winning look like for each of you? And Angelica, we'll start with you.
Well, that's a great.
And yes, this is a question we did not rehearse, so I'll just let the audience know that I'm totally, leaving you guys out in the cold here.
One, I would say heighten awareness to the community, like just having more community participation. Like even when we're discussing, no-knock warrants, like I don't believe, just from my interaction with the community, that really gets at the heart of what's going on. Like another issue what we have there is that police are allowed somehow a daytime warrant starts at 6 o'clock in the morning. And I'm not sure about you all, but if you knock on my door at 6 o'clock in the morning, that's not daytime. So we have all of these aspects. And I think with more community participation and more voices from the community, we can try to fill the gaps as far as like what needs to change as it relates to policing. So that's the first thing. And the second thing will probably be more access to information. And so it would be great if, police departments could be, there's legislation where they're sharing more information or being more accountable to other agencies as well as the community. And this just recently happened with the passing of the Civilian Police Oversight Commission here in Philadelphia, where the bill outlines not just, a subpoena power. I think a lot of people get trapped in the issue of subpoena, but direct access. So like if I'm trying to make sure you're accountable, I don't want to give you a paper saying, hey, I want to make sure you're checking this box. Like, no, I want to go directly into your database and see if the boxes are being checked. I want to view the footage to see if the residents are experiencing, the level of care and safety that they want to experience. And so I think those are great measures for evaluation for like the state of, policing, is we have more community participation and more sharing of information.
Thanks. Damon?
Thanks. Yeah, it's so many pieces, so it's difficult to lift up just a few. But I would say I'm looking to federal legislation, which is where my gaze has been as of late. And I would say there are a couple of pieces. One is a 1-2 punch of civil liability and potential criminal sanction where it's warranted. I'm not one to want to just put people in prison generally, certainly not willy-nilly, but there has to be an appropriate sanction that's available. And right now it's actually too difficult, certainly for the federal government, to do either, or for individual litigants to pursue the civil route. So we need some type of heightened, more accessible civil liability that will reach individual officers and municipalities as well, who, through complex legal doctrine, which I won't, not complex for you all, but complex in general, I won't get into, but we need some avenues for liability on those two fronts. And I also think things that do, come closer to more immediate changes to practice. So moving towards standards, it's a generational battle and shift. It won't happen overnight, but I think it's important to continue the work of that 21st century policing task force, because I think a lot of good stuff got left on the table that never did get any traction, largely because of shifts in presidential leadership.
Lisa?
Yeah, I think my first priority would be trying to figure out, John, how to translate that process that we've come up with for problem solving with community and government into something that could be a framework for other issues. We have so many issues that community and government need to solve together. Figuring out some way to have a process where you can come in and develop trust and respect to really get to the causes of problems would be ideal for me. And taking the work that we are putting together in our Sentinel event review process and helping the Seattle Police Department to build a structure and policies and a culture shift that really fosters people coming out in the streets and exercising their First Amendment rights without fear of that going sideways and having force being used against them. So that's one. Two, I'm very focused on traffic stops right now. So I sent a letter to Chief Adrian Diaz asking him to work with OIG to reduce or eliminate the stopping of people for civil violations where there's just a monetary penalty like expired registrations, and low level minor traffic violations that really don't have any safety impact whatsoever. So we are getting a work group together right now and starting to think about what that might look like and how we can move in a direction to create a scenario where law enforcement and community come into contact with each other less in those circumstances, like traffic stops where they're strangers and things can go sideways in a moment and have tragic consequences. So that's my other priority for the coming year.
Excellent. I think those are all great priorities, and I guess Angelica and Damon, to your points, right? All of them should be our top two priorities. So trying to figure out how to balance this is important, and it is important, I think, also to recognize that a balance between short-term and longer-term goals. Right? There are goals that we must do, I think, right away, and can do right away. Increased transparency. So the Quattrone Center did a review on behalf of the university's police department and made a number of recommendations that we thought would enhance the physical and emotional safety on campus. And one of the things that the report said was some of the recommendations like transparency, that can be relatively easy. Providing access to information is something that is within departments' controls, within communities' controls. Work out the rules, and figure out where the right balances are. There are other things like changing cultures that we need to be insistent about, but also recognize when we see benefits, and I think promote the bright spots that we see too, and understand that changing cultures is something that takes time. And so that balance between insistence and patience, I think, is where I personally find myself lacking a lot of the time, and needing to do better. So at this point, I've been asked to repeat all 3 of the CLE words in order for people so that we don't lose that point. So criminal, justice, and reform are your 3 CLE words. Any last words that the 3 of you would like to contribute for the good of the order in the 4 minutes that we have left?
I would just say, look, the dialogue and discourse publicly and also in this session that we're having today is fundamentally different than it would have been 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and certainly 20 years ago. So that's not progress in and of itself, but it does signal that what's starting to happen is that it's not just that we know more in terms of facts, but we're also starting to connect to what we really believe. What the real underlying narratives are about safety, about fear, about crime, about how crime is racialized and how race is criminalized, which I think is a subtext for all of this. So I don't want to let that go unsaid. And I think some good things are starting to come to light. And I believe that the changes that we've seen are only the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's possible.
Lisa, you're muted.
One more time before we end.
I just wanted to thank my fellow panelists for this great conversation. I really appreciate everything that was said and being a part of this. So thank you.
I would like to echo that. Thank you, John, for inviting us for this conversation. It was a pleasure meeting Damon and Lisa. I just hope, in the future, we are having this conversation again, we can point to more examples and, community perspectives of where we can, really good practices to try to replicate.
Yeah, obviously, my colleagues have heard me say this before, but the secret to a great party is great guests. So thank you to the 3 of you for being part of this conversation, for sharing your wisdom and your insights. And yeah, we look forward to partnering with each of you and everybody in the audience on continuing to promote these conversations as they unfold in the days, months, and years to come. So much more to come, but thank you for taking part in our Achieving Racial Justice series, and we look forward to keeping in touch on next steps.
You.
Thank you.
Have a great one.